All right, good afternoon. On behalf of the University of Redlands, thank you for joining us for Challenging Conversations. My name is Christopher Jones, and I am the university's Senior Diversity and Inclusion Officer. Challenging Conversations is a series of 4 related discussions on the subject of race in America. The author, Jim Wallace, tells us in his book of the same title that race is America's original sin. As an institution of higher education, I can tell you that we will not have all the answers, but we should be part of developing solutions. And to fix a system that's built upon racist ideology, we cannot avoid dealing with race. Over the last few weeks, our nation and our university has confronted the aftermath of the death of George Floyd and the impact of the Black Lives Matter movement, heightened awareness of racial disparities, and a groundswell of demands for change. During this period, we will continue as a university community to uphold the fundamental values of a liberal arts education, and we expose students to critical discussions, we challenge assumptions, we encourage active listening, and we allow opportunities to analyze complex situations like those we face today. We educate hearts and minds, and that is what we will do through this series. Before we begin, I would like to remind all of you listening on WebEx that the Q&A will be open throughout the event. We welcome your questions, which we will address in the last 15 or 20 minutes or so of the session. You can click on the chat icon, which looks like a talk bubble in your WebEx toolbar, to submit your questions. Time may not permit us to get through all of the questions submitted, but we will try to address as many of your questions as possible during our time together. For those questions we cannot get to during our time, our guests have agreed to provide their email address if you would like to ask them directly your questions. This is the first in our series of challenging conversations, and it's on the subject of race and justice in America. In the last few weeks, much of our nation's attention has turned to the role of policing in our communities. But when we start talking really about actionable change, we must also understand the role and interrelationship of prosecutors, defense counsel, judges, and executives, like our mayors and governors and legislators. Addressing racism within the system means understanding that system and attacking the inherent racism that supports its continued functioning every day. So let me begin by introducing the panelists for today. First, we have attorney Chris Gardner. Mr. Gardner joined the San Bernardino County Public Defender's Office in 2006 after 10 years of private practice in criminal defense and juvenile dependency throughout southern San Bernardino County. He began as a chief deputy public defender in charge of the Human Services Division. In 2010, he was appointed assistant public defender, and in 2018 was appointed as the public defender for San Bernardino County. Mr. Gardner leads a team of nearly 300 defense team members, including 136 lawyers spread out all through San Bernardino County, serving to protect the constitutional rights of those accused who cannot afford an attorney. Next, we have Deputy Chief Travis Martinez of the Redlands Police Department. Travis Martinez is currently the Deputy Chief of Police with the Redlands Police Department, overseeing the Operations Bureau comprised of investigations, narcotics, MET, patrol, forensics, crime analysis, SWAT, traffic, and community policing. He holds a master's degree in public administration and a Bachelor of Science degree in business administration from the University of Redlands in 1994. He has presented at several conferences throughout the nation and authored numerous published articles on how police departments can leverage technology to enhance their community policing. So let us begin with our questions. And the first question will go to both of our panelists. And that question is, who do you believe, or why you believe, this killing of George Floyd has ignited not just a national response, but an international response? Let's start with Attorney Gardner.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me. Well, I mean, the George Floyd killing and what it has emanated from it, I think there's a couple of reasons. First of all, I don't think you can downplay just the graphic nature of the actual event itself. We've seen in the past, police shootings or different people being police brutality going all the way back to Rodney King. But rarely, we've never actually seen someone sit there on the ground completely helpless for over 6 minutes before they pass out, and then for another 2.5 minutes go limp and sit there while he's, during that 6 minutes, he's literally begging for his life. People are watching him. Besides the law enforcement officer that had his knee on his neck, there were 3 other law enforcement officers there seemingly enabling it or helping it to happen or allowing it to happen. And I think just the graphic nature of it has been very, very strong and very, very disgusting and revolting. It dovetails with just more frustration of the fact that this has happened, frankly, time and time again, all around the country in different places. And recently, this was the third one, the third real significant killing of an African American that we had seen. One obviously in Georgia, and then another one in Kentucky, and then George Floyd. So I think people are really frustrated. They're tired of seeing that, and that's one of the reasons. I think it can't be underscored off also the backdrop of when this happened, in the middle of the COVID-19 lockdown, and people were really frustrated for that. And a lot of people also have really lost their, they've lost their jobs. They're unhappy. They're concerned. Seeing police officers do this concerned them more. And just the general political nature of our country right now, how divided we are, that adds to the frustration. And frankly, I mean, you put all those things together, and I think that we're getting the result that we need to effectuate change because of George Floyd's killing.
All right, Chief Martinez.
Yes, and to echo that, I think anybody that watches the video from Minnesota, no attempt to justify what happened. You just want to reach through that screen and push that officer and find out why those other officers aren't acting. I mean, it's just despicable. It's, it's such a long drawn out. You have residents there trying to tell the police officers, hey, he's dying, and no one takes action and no one does anything. I think that, to answer your question, that's what really makes this such an international phenomenon. Everybody is just, this is one example of, hey, there is just no, how did this happen? How were people that were supposed to be there to protect, serve, how did they let this happen? How did they get to this point? And it's just on law enforcement's end, I haven't met anybody in law enforcement that is trying to justify or trying to reason that was reasonable. I mean, it was just a despicable act. To echo Chris Gardner's words in terms of some of the other high-profile incidents that happened. We did have that incident happen down in Georgia, but I think it is important to point out that person was killed by 2 private citizens, one that had a law enforcement background, but that was just a senseless killing too. I think the initial law enforcement agency that investigated that case dropped the ball, and I think the state ended up coming in and made the arrest. But it was a sad incident. It's just the Minnesota. There's no reason for it, and I think that's what's really galvanized this incident, on an international scale.
But Chief, let's talk about that in a minute. How does this happen? How does it continue to happen? Even since George Floyd, we've seen other instances. You mentioned Georgia, And there was a recent case here just last weekend where a police officer killed a young black man. Why does this continue to happen?
Well, this last weekend case, I've seen video clips, and no doubt that the officer, that if you watch the whole case, there's definitely things that could have been changed. Now, I don't know the answer to this, and I haven't read about it, but some of the tasers that our law enforcement are deploying now, they have the capability of shooting two darts, and it are two rounds. Some of the old tasers that we have, they only have the capability of shooting one. So once one's shot, it's not a threat until you get close to that person, and you can what they call contact tase. But some of these new tasers have the capability of shooting two separate rounds at a person. Now, the video that I saw, it was, I think what it needs to be is just picked apart and frame by frame by frame before any decisions are ultimately made. And I have a feeling that's why the district attorney hasn't yet charged anybody there. They're probably going through it frame by frame by frame to determine what exactly transpired and what was going through the thought process of the officer that was involved there. But you're right, Dr. Jones. We see cases like this happen way too much. Now, if you take into account all of the contacts that law enforcement makes throughout a year, and you look at the levels of use of force, I'll say here in Redlands, over the last 3 years, I think we've had 160,000 contacts, and we've had 170 uses of force. So the chances of you being involved in a use of force, if you're contacted by police, are very small. But in today's age, everybody's carrying a phone. Everybody has a camera on them. They're able to capture, and we see some of these instances that you have to ask yourself, how is this happening? We've all had, California has been home to some of the best training, but you see in some of these demonstrations, you have to ask yourself, how is it escalating where it appears we're striking innocent ladies or ladies just standing there with batons? It's baffling on my end when we've certainly had 4 demonstrations here in Redlands. For our community, it's worked for us to reach out to the organizers, help them facilitate the process to have a safe venue, explain to them, find out what their vision is, find out explain to them what the parameters are. We've had 4 protests, and they've all gone off peaceful. I'm a firm believer that we as law enforcement we're always ready and prepared, but we never want to come across as, hey, we're expecting a fight, when there's no credible belief that there's going to be a fight that take place. And that's what happened here in Redlands. One of the reasons why we didn't go to a curfew, implement a curfew here in Redlands, is because we didn't want to make criminals out of somebody that was just coming to Redlands to peacefully protest. That if we did implement a curfew, it instantaneously creates an adversarial environment for people who are coming here to peacefully protest. And we were certainly ready to implement a curfew if we needed it, but ended up not having to go that route.
Okay, you mentioned the term baffling. So it's a little bit baffling, and also in the rest of it, in your response as well, you also talk a bit about relationship with the community. So a question for both of you is, why has the relationship between police and particularly communities of color become so strained? Chief, why don't you start?
I'm sorry, did you call on me?
Yes.
So why has it been so strained? There's countless studies out there over the years that it just seems that the studies demonstrate that the police disproportionately stop more Black Americans than other ethnicities, that they're a higher arrest rate. Now, just because we need to delve into those studies and find out why. Ask the reason why is that arrest rate much higher? Is it because there's some bias going on in the policing? And what can we do as a police department to train our people to make them understand that there is some implicit bias and that you need to overcome that implicit bias when you're doing your policing? You know, it's all about being fair and impartial. Our job is to collect the facts and turn them over to Mr. Gardner and the district attorney, and ultimately they will adjudicate the case. It's when we start letting our own emotions, our own implicit biases get in the way of our job that it seems that we are making these mistakes, and we're holding, you know, like to the term racial profiling, you know, it's against the law here in California to do any racial profiling. All of our people are trained on that. Does it still exist? In some cases that you read about, it certainly seems that way. And our job as leaders in law enforcement is to make sure that that's not taking place. And at the same time, always promote trust and police legitimacy. You know, we go in Redlands, we go through the roof to try to promote trust, to work with our community partners. You know, we only have 84 officers here in Redlands, and we believe in community-based policing. We believe, you know, I always tell people out of our last 67 murders, we solved 66 of them. And sometimes it's been because of good forensics, sometimes it's been because of technology, sometimes it's been just simple good detective work. But there's one commonality with all those murders, is that somebody's always willing to talk to us. And we only get that because we invest so much in the community. We do things like midnight hoops, tailgate with the cop at the university, backpack giveaway, bike rodeos. We're always looking at promoting and fostering public trust. We reach out to our community stakeholders. You know, it wasn't long after, it was only the next day after this happened in Minnesota, I reached out to all of our partners, our church, the local churches here, the other people we've worked with in the community, and offered my services to explain what we're here doing at the Redlands Police Department, to minimize the chances of something like that happening here in Redlands. I mean, I just don't see it happening based on everything we do, but it doesn't mean that it can't. And so we're always working towards educating our people, making sure our people are in tune with what's going on the national level, working with our community partners. So
let me let Attorney Gardner get in on this question.
Sure. Well, you know, the reason there's so much tension is, I mean, you know, Chief Martinez mentioned a couple of them. The first thing is there's a lot of tension because even though racial profiling is illegal, it happens all the time, And on top of that, you know, implicit bias, different officers' implicit biases when they're out in the community. But really, you know, last 20 or 30 years, we've been dealing with the term proactive policing, trying to stop things before they happen. And when officers are out there trying to stop things before they happen, they're trying to figure out who is probably about to commit a crime or what can we do to stop something from happening. And that is where, quite frankly, the racial profiling and implicit biases and racism comes into play all the time. I can only imagine how difficult it would be to be a police officer, the kind of split-second decisions they have to make, and the fact they're putting their lives on the line all the time. I have great respect for that. But the question about why is the relationship between police and communities of color so strained, it is primarily because of implicit bias and community policing, or excuse me, proactive policing, and the fact that there is racism and racial profiling going on. It also is a fact that over the last 20 or 30 years, the prison to pipeline, or school to pipeline, prison to pipeline situation has primarily dealt with communities of color. They're a disproportionate amount of the people who are going in prison. So I commend Chief Martinez for the things he's talking about the proactive approaches that the Redlands Police Department is doing in the community of Redlands. Is very, very important. And if that kind of stuff were done everywhere, it would help everywhere. But the problem is having an after school program for someone's son or daughter when that person has been locked up for a long time for something that wasn't really that serious, which has happened in California for a long time. You can't balance out those hard feelings in the African American community and the people where my clients come from. Their distrust of the police isn't going to be balanced out by some really good programming in the community, because they're so hardened in their beliefs that they have been unfairly targeted for so long, and that's what it is. And I don't know the answer to it, but that's why they have such distrust of police officers.
Okay, well, let's move to this next question then. Senator Kamala Harris, one of our senators, made comments recently that it will be difficult to get convictions against the 4 officers in Minneapolis. Now, that comment was made in some context. And so some would think that it would be impossible for that to happen based on what we've seen through the videos. But Attorney Gardner, can you talk a bit about your response to those comments from Senator Harris and where those problems might be in these cases? And I should say that context is, in some places, both Senator Harris and Senator Cory Booker have introduced legislation on the Senate side, and the House Democrats have also introduced legislation about criminal justice reform, trying to address issues like qualified immunity and other protections that are afforded to law enforcement officers. But from your perspective, Attorney Gardner, can you respond to those comments, Senator Harris?
The comments specifically about whether or not there will be convictions sustained against all 4 of those officers in Minneapolis.
Yes.
I certainly understand exactly what Senator Harris was talking about. And she was a former prosecutor and a former attorney general. The fact of the matter is, even the deputy who had his knee on the neck of Mr. Floyd, and clearly I think in all of our accounts would say murdered Mr. Floyd. That's not how it works. They got to prove in a courtroom beyond a reasonable doubt that police officer was thinking he was going to kill Mr. Floyd. That's what he's charged with. Now he's charged with 3rd-degree murder, and I'm not totally familiar with the laws of Minnesota. If you know, but in California, we don't have 3rd-degree murder. I would say it's more akin to a voluntary manslaughter type of situation. And I don't know that they would have that deputy or that prosecutors in California would be able to get a 1st-degree murder conviction against that officer who had his knee on his neck. There's just no way of knowing what was in his mind. And, you know, I don't know what that person's background was. And the fact of the matter is, I don't know if they were trained to do that. I don't know if he had done that 100 times before and nothing negative happened to the person that he was arresting. And if that's a standard technique that he had used and nothing bad had happened to the person, then from his defense, as his defense counsel, it would be easy to argue, well, he didn't know that he was killing this person. He had done this a whole bunch of times before. It's very difficult to look inside someone's mind, especially in a situation as unique as this, and say for sure that they're going to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that that officer had the requisite intent needed to get that conviction. That's just the facts. And you know, like I said, I don't know what is needed. I mean, for a manslaughter case, to prove that he was reckless, showed disregard or indifference to Mr. Floyd's life, I think that's a lot. I think that's definitely going to be able to be made, but it's not a guarantee. The other 3 officers that were around, you know, I understand a couple of those officers had only been there a couple of days or like a week or something. If the police officer in charge was the guy who was supposed to be in charge of training these guys, and he was doing that to that person, to Mr. Floyd, you know, I think it's a lot to ask. Any human being should have stepped in and stopped what happened. But from a defense standpoint, depending on what those other 3 people are charged with and their experience on the street and what they've been through and what they were trained, I'm not positive that they're going to be able to get a conviction. I mean, I think what Senator Harris said is right. It's not a slam dunk. As bad as it will be if those officers are acquitted, and what will happen in America if they're acquitted. Last night I was watching the story of the Rodney King situation. That's when I was at the University of Redlands, and probably the chief too. And the fact of the matter is, that was as clear cut as you could get. But like Chief Martinez said, they broke it down frame by frame by frame by frame, all of the videos, and they were able to get an acquittal. So it's going to take some hard work by the prosecutors to get convictions on these counts.
If I could add,
Yeah, it's really important to think about that. Chief Martinez?
If I could add, I do think they upgraded it to second-degree murder charges. They were arrested originally out for third degree, and they upgraded it to second degree. But what I've been told is and I haven't had time to research this personally, but what I've told is that that was an acceptable a technique to be used on somebody with excited delirium in Minnesota. Now, if that's part of their training, that's the onus on the law enforcement leaders to stay in tune with, hey, what's the best way to, is that an appropriate level of force? In California, it's not. We don't train on that. But if that was their training in Minnesota, then that's what the senators or Kamala Harris is referring to. Another thing you probably have to think about is I would guess that they're going to look for a change of venue. If they get a change of venue, going to a different location there in Minnesota, it's probably a little bit different than Minneapolis, and that may be, like Chris was saying, you have to get 12 people to convict. If you get 1 or 2 people and it's a hung jury, we're going to be dealing with round two. But from the video, it certainly looks obviously despicable, but it's still a big, it's very difficult for us to get convictions on for murders. We have to prove stuff, and it's very difficult to get a conviction against an officer. I think if you look through the history, a murder conviction on an officer, it's very challenging, and I'm sure Chris could speak to that, but I think that's what maybe Senator Harris was referring to.
And if I could just jump in real quick, I think it's really important to note that whether they're convicted or not, personally, I hope that they're convicted, but all of the sea change of the momentum that is gained as a result of Mr. Floyd's case and where we're at in America, the direction we're moving, none of that is should be derailed or deterred because of what happens in the courtroom. The fact of the matter is, those folks are innocent until proven guilty, and I'm sure they're going to have very good attorneys. I'm sure the unions are going to provide them with very good attorneys, and that's the way the game is played. But the reality of the situation is, the second degree murder charge, they could find him guilty of something less. I think that was one reason to go up to the second degree murder charge, to be honest, because they would have filed it originally at second degree if they thought right off the bat they could prove it. I think they're in a tough spot. They want to, I was hearing people ask me, why is it taking them so long to make a decision? Why is it taking them so long? And really, having not been a prosecutor, but I've worked with them and I know them, they don't want to lose. They don't want to lose this case. They know what this case means. So they're trying to figure out what they really believed they could get a conviction on based on the evidence that they had. That's what they're supposed to do. So I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens, but I don't think it's going to, whether they win or lose at this point, there's a possibility that the entire Minneapolis Police Department will be defunded and will start over. And that's a possibility. I'm not saying it needs to happen, but there's going to be significant consequences to the folks in Minneapolis and the law enforcement all over the country as a result of what we saw in that video.
And both of you are speaking to really big, important points about the system, and that there are systemic things that really go into what happens from the time that someone comes into custody through the time that there's actually ultimately some kind of adjudication in the court. Chief Martinez, the fact is that people of color, they're suspicious, they're fearful, they're afraid of the police. And there is power in the system. And let's be real, one aspect of that power is the ability to apply the rules as one sees fit on the street. We've seen efforts, Attorney Gardner just mentioned, but talking about defunding the police. But let's look at this aspect. How do you think public safety is going to look in the next 5 years? And a related part of that, what needs to happen over the next 5 years to improve policing with respect to people of color and in communities of color, African Americans, Latinx, and all other folks in our nation?
Well, I think there's going to definitely be some changes made. I think one, and I think it was the president talked about in an executive order he issued today was creating some type of national database to make sure that the bad apples don't go to another location or another city. That if they, there's going to be some type of national registry for excessive force, for officers that have been convicted of sustained excessive force. And so I think that's going to take place. I think there's throughout on a national level, there's going to be a clear cut when can officers use force conditions. Here in California, it's you have to only be able to use a reasonable force to effect an arrest. I think there's probably going to be some changes in how police unions, what the role of police unions and how they fund different political candidates. Should police unions be donating to political candidates? That's always a question that I've had a hard time grappling with. Why are we in the business of trying to get somebody elected? We're supposed to be a fair and impartial branch of the criminal justice system. We're on the front lines. We are the ones collecting the evidence. We're the ones dealing with the people. We put the case together. We give it to the attorneys. I think there's going to be some changes made with what police unions can do, because some of these police unions around the country are very, very powerful. They donate thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of dollars to different political candidates, and you have to ask yourself, why is that happening? We talk about de-escalation and the duty to intervene. From when I was in the police academy in '94, there was training on intervention. Hey, no matter if you're a brand new, recruit, first day on the job, if your partner's doing something that's unlawful, you have a duty to interject. I can tell you, shortly after I finished my training program, we had a vehicle burglary, and I ended up chasing a guy down and ended up catching him in the Zanky right there close to the university. It was a pretty good little foot pursuit. Caught the guy, put cuffs on him, and a senior officer, actually a supervisor, came up and asked him a question, and he did not like the answer, and he immediately hit the person I had in handcuffs. I immediately interjected, like, whoa, hey, this is my arrest. I got this guy. But a couple hours later, this was at 3:30 in the morning, I'm talking to the sergeant. He's like, hey, I just want you to know what happened out there. This is what happened. And we were trained back in '94 that to intervene. And by golly, if we can't do that as officers, we shouldn't be in this role. And so that goes to, we really take our hiring process very seriously. We're looking for people that are involved in community service, people that have diversified backgrounds, people that really, quite frankly, have some type of connection to Redlands, because, if this is your community, you're going to see these people at the supermarket that you've arrested. And you want to be able to say, people get the fact that it is a violent profession. We do have to put hands on sometimes. We are, some people just do not want to obey the laws, and some people want to, we've had the Dorner incident. We had the terrorists here from Redlands. Some people are just intent on killing. I always tell the new people, it's kind of like football. When I played football at the U of R, and Coach Mayer always stressed, hey, you play in between the whistles. So in between the whistles, hey, if you get a good hit, hey, that's all good, but there's no honor in getting a late hit. 3 seconds after the whistle plays, the other team gets an automatic first down, you get a 15-yard penalty, and Coach Mayer would have you on the bench. So it's kind of like the same thing with policing. There's sometimes that we're gonna have to be hands-on, but you got to play in between the whistles. If you can't play in between the whistles, then you shouldn't be in this profession. And you got to be able to make those split-second decisions. And so, I guess before I digress anymore, did I get the whole answer, Chris?
Yeah, that's fine. So let's go kind of to a larger point of what you're talking about, I think, which is or at least bringing into play, which is this role of profiling. Both of you have mentioned this term before. Attorney Gardner, we know police agencies do profile, and oftentimes it's, they will tell you that profiling is based on criminal behavior, but we know that those profiles sometimes are really built with a view that's inherent with racism. I'm sure your office deals with this issue constantly in the cases that you have in your clients. So talk to us a bit about the impact of this issue. More important, talk to the audience and talk to us about what we need to do to fix this situation. If you had the authority of the governor's pen tomorrow, what would you do?
Well, I had to. So here, if there's one thing that I would say that could be done with a magic wand, I would say that law enforcement has to stop interacting with people, causing interaction with folks, or going to interact with them based on their skin color. That shouldn't happen. And I think that is the racial profiling we're talking about. That is the, Chief Martinez talks about his first arrest and how he did the right thing, and he did the right thing. He effectuated the arrest correctly. And then when a senior officer came and did something that he shouldn't have done, Chief Martinez followed the rules, and that's part of the reason why Chief Martinez is now where he is, because he did things the right way. But the problem is, too many times I believe they don't train racial profiling in the academies. Police officers don't become police officers. They may have their own implicit biases. I mean, everybody has implicit biases, and I think they should be studying and trained for that more in the academy, and maybe even in the hiring process as well. I mean, in the hiring process, they spend a lot of time. They go through lie detector tests, and they ask them if they've ever smoked weed, or if they ever had, they ask them all kinds of personal questions, but they don't really ask them if they ever committed a crime. And a lot of those kick out good candidates because people made a mistake when they're 18, 19, 20, and now they can't become police officers. Depends on, but they never really ask them, are you a racist? What are your implicit biases? What do you think about this? What does this scenario make you think about? And they need to spend more time on that. But then when they get through the academy and they get out on their job, and they think we all know that there's what we learn in school and then what we learn in real life when we get on the job. And when they get on the job and they're sitting there with whoever their mentor is on the job, and 3 African-American males roll by in a car, or 3 Hispanics do, and they get up to follow them just to wait and see if they're going to commit a traffic violation so they can stop them, just to see what's going on, just to interfere with them. That's what they do. That's the type of proactive policing that I was talking about earlier. That should just be gone. Police officers are very important. We need them to protect us. We don't need them to go looking for problems. And I think the problem is that's kind of what happens. And it is the group, the people of color, that get followed the most and get pulled over the most. I mean, we're talking about the killing of George Floyd, and it was horrific. And we've mentioned, and I appreciate the chief pointing out the situation in Georgia, that it wasn't a law enforcement officer, and then the Breonna Taylor situation in Kentucky and others. But these are just the ones that are grabbing the headlines because people are dying. And the fact of the matter is, as the story that Chief Martinez just mentioned, if the typical, what we hear from our clients, if they run from a police officer and they get caught, they're going to get hit once or twice. And that usually that happens a lot. And the fact of the matter is, it shouldn't. So, just because we see the cases where deaths occur, that's the very small percentage of cases where some police cross the line.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. I'm going to ask this next question before we open it up to questions.
Chris, can I interject real quick? Can I interject?
All right, go ahead.
Just clarify a couple things. They do. At the academy, they do have a cultural and diversity and ethics class that they teach at the academy, and that's part of the racial profiling. As part of our FTO program, we go into a whole section on racial profiling. Here at the Redlands PD, I want to say in 2016, California passed the RIPA Act. It's the Racial Identity Profiling Act, where right now all the bigger departments are collecting the data on every stop. We, as Redlands PD, will be doing that next year. And so I think they're making great strides towards that. But we probably have I definitely have a different view on Chris's statement about if we get in a foot pursuit, everybody went at the end, people get hit a couple times. I definitely don't agree with that, but we probably just reserve that argument for another day.
I'm not saying all the time or every time or everybody. I'm saying it does happen. And, you know, I mean, maybe it doesn't happen in Redlands. I'm in charge of the whole county for the public defender. I talk to clients from all over the county, and, you know, it happens some places.
And let's admit for this purpose, it does happen. Again, I want to ask this final question before we open it up. And I want to get both of your reactions to a piece. It's a recent op-ed that I read that was written by a former police chief, PhD, former deputy mayor of a major city in this country. And he would say, a Black man who lives in this country. And what he wrote is that there must be a major effort to fundamentally restructure police departments so that they actually do what they promise, serve and protect people. This should include a change at all levels. And here's what they must do to get started. 1, regular higher aptitude and fitness standards for incoming recruits. 2, require mental health checkups to deal with the stress and challenges of law enforcement. 3, develop a nationwide database of all officers to prevent bad officers from jumping departments to avoid marks on their permanent record. 4, stop promoting officers to become supervisors who have multiple disciplinary complaints, particularly to positions of first-line leaders like sergeants and lieutenants. And then 5, rehabilitation of police unions, because their intransigence makes it almost impossible to fire and hold officers accountable for breaking the law and the public's trust. And that's the end of his piece. Now, for both of you, I just want to know what your reaction is to that. More important, would these changes have any real effect? How does any of this stop the kinds of excessive force that we see so regularly in our communities?
So here, all right, I'll take first shot at it. So in terms of the nationwide database, I mentioned a little bit about that. And earlier on the phone, I was with somebody that's well known throughout the nation on policing and often commentates to different news channels. But you don't see it so much here in California, but in some of the other states, you do see where, hey, they have a sustained complaint, and then they end up resigning, and then they go to another agency. I totally agree. We need to have some type of national registry. Nothing frustrates me more than going through a hiring process, and I've had this happen to me as somebody that's hiring. You find out that you're looking at the background of the person. You're like, and you send your background investigator out, and let me make a comment on that real quick. In California, we do all background investigations. We send people out of state, and when they start looking into the P file, or they start talking to associates of them, we find out, hey, this was never mentioned in the application, nor was it ever mentioned by any type of supervisory review. And that is frustrating to no end. I never want to be in a position where I have to explain, hey, how come we didn't hold somebody accountable that should have been held accountable here at Redlands PD? You don't want to pass on the bad apple, so to speak. In terms of the complaints, I think it is important to note that you need to get sustained complaints. There are people, when we do our investigations, our professional standards office does very detailed. We leave no stone unturned, but unfortunately, there are some people that make things up in terms of frivolous complaints. I will tell you, early on in my career, on a speeding ticket that I issued, this person filed a complaint against me for kicking his motorcycle over. And when the sergeant called me into his office, I was like, well, that absolutely didn't happen. And that's why we as PDs, our people want to go to body worn cameras. Our people have audio recorders. I can't tell you how many times we get a complaint and we listen to the audio recording, and I'll end up sitting down with the complaint. And I was like, okay, you tell me this, but the audio recording says this, and ultimately they withdraw their complaint and such. In terms of the mental health, officer wellness is a priority for us. We have employee assistant programs that we set up. If any time an officer is involved in a traumatic incident, we give them the availability of the counseling team. and such. So I missed that last point of yours, Chris. You were speaking a little fast, but I was trying to write them down so I could remember. But I missed that last point, so maybe Chris could speak.
The last one was about police unions. I think you actually talked about that earlier. So why don't we let Attorney Gardner go ahead and respond?
Well, I think each one of those would be important. I would say that, the hiring process, obviously it's important throughout everything that was mentioned in that article is important. I mean, who you hire is critical. How you choose to hire them is critical, and what things you focus on. And I have never hired police officers. Okay. I've hired lawyers. And I want to say one thing about what the chief is talking about. Yeah, my lawyers, people complain about us public defenders all the time. And just like they probably complain about police officers all the time. And you have to, when I get a complaint, I don't, I can't rush to judgment. I go and I look at what happened. And the vast majority of the time, my lawyer has not done anything wrong. So I particularly understand exactly what the chief is talking about that. We have to protect people's rights, and you are, you are innocent. You do deserve, no matter what your job, if you're accused of something. But I think the main thing is for police officers, for everybody, a thorough investigation. And listening to what the chief's talking about goes on in Redlands, the hiring process, the training process, the mental health component, and the ability for the officers to have access to that. And then when you're going through the promotion process, looking at their record with a really keen eye to see if they were the bad apples, if they did have those kind of experiences. And the other thing is, what happened in Minneapolis and what's happened in Georgia a couple of times in Atlanta, fire them and worry about the lawsuit that's coming later. If just do the right thing. And I think the union thing, that last point, that's where that's really been very, very important, is that they're so powerful and they have so much power that a lot of times they intimidate the decision makers. And that needs to be stopped because what needs to be done is what's right. And then we'll figure out what's right. If the person's doing something wrong or dangerous on the street, get them off the street, and then we'll figure out the rest later.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Let's go ahead and open it up for questions from the participants, the audience, and I believe that's being moderated.
There are a couple of comments noting that just as today, felony murder charges were filed in Atlanta for the officer in question. I know we had talked about that earlier today. That is one of the things we're addressing. Can you please explain qualified immunity in layman's terms and how it tends to protect police officers from accusations of misconduct and excessive force?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I lost my screen, so I was trying to get the questions. So, Chris, do you want to have at this, or do you want me to
go ahead.
tackle it?
You're up.
So, in terms of qualified immunity, what that means is that when we're taking a lawful action as a police, or we're taking some type of action that's lawful, and that we can't be sued over it for our personal possessions. And so in terms of the qualified, there's a push right now to take away the qualified immunity for protection for police officers. And if that were to happen, it would have some really lasting effects in terms of any interaction that we do as a police officer. We're putting our family and our kids at risk for being sued. And just based on some time, we talked about the complaints, I think there'll probably be several lawsuits filed, just even if they were frivolous. So I don't know I definitely don't agree with that going down, because that would change the scope of policing much for the worse.
And I think, so it's real interesting. The qualified immunity, I deal with that on our side. The prosecutors have qualified immunity, and if they are doing their job and they're prosecuting a case and the person is found not guilty, they can't go back and sue the prosecutor for that. And it's kind of, and that's, you know, as the chief says, can you imagine if you're in charge of a case, and if you don't win the case, you're going to get, you're going to get sued. Like he said, they're going to be loath to get involved in things, so it is a very tricky situation. I think the real key is qualified immunity should be only for them when they're doing things lawfully. Okay. When they're effectuating a lawful arrest, or they have to kill someone because it was life or death. That's them doing their job. I believe they probably should have protection for that. But it's when they step outside of doing something lawful and go overboard, or do something that was not required, that is the sticking point. Because right now it's really hard to sue any law enforcement for anything, which, whether you believe it or not, that's just the facts. So, getting real qualified immunity, like let's take the George Floyd situation, like we were talking. If the chief was right that police officer had been trained to do that, and he had done that a whole bunch of times in the past, and nothing had happened, and would he lose a lawsuit for that? Maybe he would not even lose a lawsuit for that. So there's a lot to unpack in that question.
All right, let's go to the next question.
All right, the next question is, in your opinion, what is most needed, law reform or police reform, if laws are being used to rationalize murder now?
Okay, the question is, what's the difference between law reform and police reform?
It's in the context of laws being used to rationalize murder. Are we better off reforming the laws or the police?
So I would take it quick. I mean, laws are reformed all the time and changed all the time, and can be changed all the time. It's really, quite frankly, through the legislative process, it can get done if there's a will to do it. Police reform is needed, and it's much more complicated and much more difficult to effectuate than just changing the laws. And not all police are bad by any stretch of the imagination, and not all agencies are bad by any stretch of the imagination, and some are much more progressive than others around the country. I mean, it's a huge potpourri of progressiveness around the country in terms of the professionalism of law enforcement agencies, and what is tolerable in one department and what will not be tolerated in a different department. But I personally believe that is what we need to work on now. Of course, it's easy for me to say, I'm the public defender, but I do believe that changing new laws are passed every day. It's enforcing the laws that is what's important, and the people that enforce the laws are law enforcement officers.
All right. Next question.
There are several questions regarding body cams. How far are we from them being an absolute requirement, as well as what is the process currently when an officer has been found using excessive force? And a third follow-up question on, do we publish information about which officers have been designated as having used excessive force?
Okay, so the first question has to do with body cameras. For the state to mandate cameras, that means they would have to pay for them. And so I think the state has pretty much left it up to every local jurisdiction. I can tell you here at Redlands, we put in for body cameras for the last 6 years in our budget. However, they've been cut from the budget every time. Our people want body cameras. We as the administrators want body cameras, just like we want audio digital recorders. The problem has always been in the cost for the storage and the cost to redact all of the innocent people in the footage that we have to release, on Public Records Act. Not to say that, I mean, one case could save the city millions and millions of dollars if we had body camera footage. But unfortunately, we just have not been able. We certainly have companies in mind that we would go with, and we've done all the research and we're ready to enact it. It's just above our pay grade here at the PD in terms of the fiscal budgetary matter, or the crisis that we're in right now. The second question, Tracy, say that again.
Do we publish information about the officers that are disciplined for excessive force?
So, I've been either the deputy chief or assistant chief for the last 3 years now. Every year we do use of force review board, where we take, let me back up here. If there was all officers, if you're here at Redlands, if you're involved in a use of force, you're mandated by our policy we report it. We do what we call a administrative report on it. That goes to the lieutenant or the commander in charge of that unit. They review the whole thing. They determine if there's any out of compliance. It then goes to me. I review it. It then goes to another supervisor review. So there's 3 levels there. At the end of the year, we hash all of those. We do a complete review with a sergeant or with 2 sergeants and a deputy chief to make sure that nothing was missed. From there, what I'm discussing with our chief right now is possibly bringing in some type of citizen review board so that they can review all of the use of forces that we have. We do have a privacy council, but they haven't been looking at the use of forces. And I think we're going to probably implement some type of change when the chief gets back next week. Was there another question, Tracy?
No, I think that addressed the ones with body cameras. I'm attempting to go through them. Thank you, everyone, for your patience.
All right. I think we have time for one more brief question with a brief response from panelists.
I will go with this one. Many have talked about the purchase of military equipment as a reason for the escalation of tensions, mistrust, and violence in police community relations. In what ways have you seen this impact your work in the Police and Public Defender's Office?
Are you tackling this one? Is it related to the Public Defender's Office? You kind of broke up, Tracy.
Yeah, I'll take a quick stab at it. I don't necessarily know that it's impacting us at the Public Defender's Office so much as, we are a general fund department, and if people are deciding, there's only X amount of dollars to go around, and if they are choosing to spend money on military like stuff, I guess technically all of the departments don't get some of that money. But I don't, that's not here in San Bernardino County. We've been well funded. The Public Defender's Office is well funded. Board of Supervisors recognize the importance of our job, how we are an important part of the justice system, and they have given us what we need to do our job. So I don't really think it's impacting us a whole lot. I think it's tough to go out. Look, I've been to a couple demonstrations, and it's like people who are dressed in thongs, flip-flops, and T-shirts, and the police officers, for their own protection, are dressed like football players. So you ought not, it can be a little intimidating, but it's not affecting our job right now.
Can I make a comment real quick, Tracy?
Real brief, 30 seconds, please.
Real brief. So we purchased, or we didn't even purchase. It was our rescue vehicle was an old refurbished MRAP. We've only used it probably 5 times. One of them being on the terrorist incident with the shooting back in 2015. We have strict parameters on how to use it, and that was given to us. It didn't charge us, or there was no expense to it other than repainting it and refurbishing it a little bit. But we did not. Any of the military surplus is given to the departments, and in this case, this is the only thing we've ever used, and we use it as a rescue vehicle.
All right, thank you. So we're at the end of our time today. You can, again, each of our guests have graciously allowed us to provide their email so that you can contact them. You can reach Chief Martinez at tmartinez, it's TMARTINEZ at redlandspolice.org. You can reach Attorney Chris Gardner at cgardner, that's CGARDNER at pd.sbcounty.gov. I thank our panelists, and I thank each of you for your attendance and participation today. We hope you enjoyed this program, and please join us next week for part 2 of the series, which is Diversity in America. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Go Bulldogs.
Bulldogs, right.